At the beginning of the story, we are introduced to Jake Hunter, who has just arrived in a remote village. Jake then goes into a bar to just drink beer. But a female waitress was attracted by Jake's attitude, who seemed cool and didn't talk much or so gentle. The woman tried to seduce Jake with her very seductive dance. But a young man named Bobby was jealous to see that, because it turns out that Bobby has long had a crush on the waitress, but the waitress always rejected him because she felt Bobby was still raw and inexperienced. Bobby then approached Jake and challenged him to a one-on-one duel to win the waitress's heart. However, Jake, who really just wanted to drink, then left the bar. But Bobby continued to provoke him. He even insulted Jake as a cowardly old man. Until finally Jake was annoyed. And this is what he did. He initially tried to leave, but Bobby pulled him. So Jake counterattacked and smashed Bobby's face into the bar table. Then Jake was brutalized. At the same time, a man named Nichols appeared with a group of police. It turns out that Nichols is a village chief in the village, and these policemen are corrupt policemen who are his henchmen. Because Jake was considered to be troublemaker in his village, Jake was then taken to the nearest police station. And at the police station, we were told that Bobby, the young man who was beaten by Jake at the bar earlier, turned out to be the biological son of Nichols, the village chief. Of course, Nichols didn't accept that his son was severely beaten by a foreigner in his village. Nichols then interrogated Jake regarding where he came from and what his purpose was in coming to his village. It turns out that the people in the village don't really like foreigners coming in, especially brutal people like Jake. But Jake was silent and refused to answer all the questions. This clearly made Nichols even more annoyed and intended to hit him with a truncheon. However, he didn't do that because he was called by Maggie, his younger sister, who told him to go home immediately for lunch. But before leaving, Nichols assigned the corrupt policeman to teach Jake a lesson. If Sheriff Kim not came, Jake might have died of suffocation. Kim immediately chased the corrupt cops away and took over the task of watching Jake. Kim apologized to Jake for the harsh treatment of the officers in his village. Then Kim released the handcuffs in Jake's hand, but after being released, Jake threatened Kim with her own gun. Then Jake escapes from the police station while stealing the sheriff's car. Then the scene moves to Nichols' residence. It turns out that Nichols is the richest landlord in the village. Arriving home, Nichols immediately scolded his son who liked to make trouble, because every time Bobby makes trouble, Nichols has to step in. Solve it with the dirty way, assisted by his henchmen, that is the corrupt police. Nichols asked Bobby if he knew Jake, so he had to get into a fight with him. Bobby replied that he didn't know Jake at all. The fight was based on Bobby's jealousy alone. Then at the dinner table, Nichols asked Bobby to find out Jake's background, because at the police station earlier Nichols found a photo of a girl in Jake's jacket. It turned out that Nichols knew the girl in the photo, who turned out to be Bobby's ex-girlfriend. This girl is known as Melissa, who was killed a year ago. It is known that Melissa died tragically in the village. Nichols was curious, wanting to know what the relationship was between Jake and Melissa, because Nichols felt that Jake's arrival in the village was related to Melissa's death. The scene switches to Jake, who is now on his way, where it turns out that Jake is now heading to Nichols' place, the village chief. Finally, it was discovered that Jake was a former Special Forces soldier. On the way, Jake then stopped the car. Then Jake checked the trunk of the car, which contained a firearm. Then Sheriff Kim contacted Jake via radio communication in the car. Kim asked Jake to return the car and turn himself in, but Jake refused. Jake told Kim if his business in the village was over, then he would return the car. It turns out that Jake's goal in the village was none other than to look for his daughter, where Melissa, Bobby's ex-girlfriend, was Jake's biological daughter. Melissa is known to have disappeared in the village, and Jake didn't know at all that his daughter had died a year ago. The scene switches to Nichols and his sister, who are meeting with their business colleagues. It turns out that Nichols is a mafia leader in the guise of a village chief who runs an illegal goods business under the guise of an olive oil business. After the meeting, Nichols relaxed outside the house while enjoying a cigarette, but suddenly Jake appeared at gunpoint. At the same time, Bobby also appeared. Then Jake interrogated Nichols and Bobby regarding the whereabouts of his daughter, Melissa. It turns out that while at the bar, Jake saw his daughter's bracelet, worn by Bobby. From here, Bobby and Nichols just found out that Jake is Melissa's biological father, and Jake's arrival in the village was none other than to look for his daughter. With a heavy heart, Bobby told Jake that Melissa had died a year ago due to an overdose of illegal stuff when they were busy partying drugs, and Bobby felt very sorry and sad for the death of his ex-girlfriend. Hearing this, of course, Jake was very angry to know that his daughter died in such a tragic way, and of course Jake blamed Bobby for making his daughter to die. Until without thinking, Jake immediately shot Bobby to death. Seeing his son die in front of his eyes, of course Nichols was furious, but he couldn't do anything because Jake was holding a gun. Then Jake was shot by Nichols' younger sister from the upstairs terrace. Jake then ran to the center of the garden. Then Nichols assigned his men to immediately catch and bring Jake to him, until the chase with gunfire that couldn't be avoided anymore. Jake, who was injured from being shot, tried to escape while putting up a fight. Then Jake hid in the water machine, and when Nichols' men approached, Jake immediately came out and slaughtered them one by one. Then we will be introduced to Stone, the corrupt police chief who is Nichols' henchman. Stone doesn't seem to accept that all his men were slaughtered by Jake, who was alone. In need of additional troops, Stone then contacted his colleague at the police station. Stone's colleague is named Bartlett. However, Stone asked Bartlett to keep this a secret from Sheriff Kim, because Stone was worried that Kim, who was a clean and honest officer, would find out about his rottenness working for Nichols, the mafia chief under the guise of a village chief. Long story short, Bartlett arrived. However, the policeman had lost track of Jake, who was still trapped in the vast estate. Stone then flew several drones to facilitate their search. After almost an hour in the plantation, Bartlett still hadn't found Jake. They only found Stone's men lying lifeless. That scared Bartlett, and he decided to leave the garden. However, when going out, he was intercepted by Jake, but Jake didn't intend to kill him. Rather to leave a message to Sheriff Kim to meet him in the garden alone. After that, Jake hid in a hut, treated his gunshot wound, and also rested for a while. Eventually, Bartlett reached the police station and immediately relayed a message from Jake to Sheriff Kim. That means that Jake wanted to meet with Kim at the farm. Until nightfall, Stone then went to Nichols and told him about his team who had still failed to find Jake. Even so, Stone and his team promised to continue the search the next morning. There was also Nichols' boss who asked the village chief to resolve the issue immediately. That's because if it is allowed to drag on, worried that it will spread to the public and it will definitely have a bad impact on their illegal business in the village. Meanwhile, Sheriff Kim is still confused about Jake's want to meet her 4 eyes. Bartlett then suggested to Kim to comply with Jake's wishes. Because if his wishes are rejected, it is feared that Jake will become even more brutal, because Bartlett witnessed many of his men die due to the brutality of the former special forces. Turning to Jake, who reminisces about being together with his daughter, Melissa. It turns out that Melissa doesn't really like Jake because of his profession as a special forces man, who often left Melissa since she was a child. In fact, Melissa still blames Jake for the death of her mother who died, while Jake was on duty. On that basis, Jake felt very guilty and sorry for neglecting his small family, so that the daughter he loved had to die horribly. Then the next day, Nichols' colleague named Murphy arrived. Murphy is a former Special Forces general who also happens to be Jake's former superior in the military. Murphy suggested to Nichols and his sister that they hide immediately. As long as Jake was still roaming the farm, Nichols and his sister's lives would most likely be in danger. Murphy is familiar with Jake, who is one of the most brutal former Special Forces. Jake will not let his daughter's killers live in peace. Even though Nichols had dozens of armed troops, it was still nothing to Jake. However, Nichols ignored Murphy's advice, and instead arrogantly said that Jake would die first in his hands. Nichols wouldn't let his son's killer get out of his garden alive, no matter what. While he was fast asleep, Jake was attacked by Stone and his men. But in the end, Jake could slaughter them all, and then took Stone as a hostage. Long story short, Sheriff Kim arrives at the plantation and meets directly with Jake. Jake then told her about his daughter, who was killed by Nichols. Jake also reported on Nichols' oil business, which turned out just to cover up their illegal business on the plantation. Many innocent girls were killed by Nichols, including Jake's own daughter. However, Nichols always escaped the law because he was helped by corrupt police officers. Jake said that if Kim didn't believe him, she could check the list of missing persons at the police station. There, everything is clearly recorded, including a list of names for Melissa, Jake's daughter, who disappeared a year ago. Then Jake invites Kim to cooperate in bringing down Nichols and his henchmen. Of course, Kim refuses to cooperate with Jake before she finds out the truth for herself about all the crimes of the village chief. Shortly after Kim left, Jake immediately interrogated Stone about the chronology of his daughter's death. Stone is silent at first, but after being tortured by Jake, Stone was finally forced to talk. Actually, Melissa didn't die immediately from an overdose. She could have been saved if she had been taken to the hospital on time. But Stone and the other corrupt cops instead raped Melissa, who was dying. Knowing that his daughter was raped in turn by corrupt policemen in a dying state, of course Jake was very angry. Until without thinking, Jake immediately finished Stone in a very brutal way. Jake can't wait to slaughter Murphy and all his minions. The death of Stone and the other corrupt cops also reached the ears of Nichols' superiors. He then asked for help from the general, that is Murphy, to immediately stop Jake's brutality. That's because, as Jake's former boss, Murphy must know how to stop his former subordinates. Then Murphy went to Sheriff Kim at the police station. Murphy asks to be involved in the mission to ambush Jake at the plantation. At first, Kim was reluctant to involve Murphy because this wasn't his authority area. However, she was forced to involve Murphy because he was a general who had connections to the top officers of the police. After the agreement was made, they began to organize a strategy to ambush Jake at the plantation. Kim was called by Jake, picked up directly by Murphy. Murphy then advised Jake to immediately surrender nicely, because if not, he will decline hundreds of army troops to immobilize Jake on the plantation. Of course, Jake refused to surrender, even though the one who advised him was a former superior whom he respected very much. Jake would continue his mission to eliminate Nichols and his henchmen, who had brutally murdered Jake's daughter. Jake will not leave the plantation before his revenge is avenged. Jake even told Murphy, as a general who upholds justice, Murphy should be on his side and not on the side of the corrupt village chief. Hearing this, Murphy could only keep silent, thinking about the words of his former subordinate. However, Murphy was still forced to send hundreds of Special Forces soldiers to guard the Nichols residence. To cut a long story short, Jake arrived at Nichols' place and came under fire with the troops sent by Murphy, whose operation was monitored directly by Murphy via radio monitor. Jake was getting more and more brutal, and in the end, he could slaughter most of them. But unfortunately, Jake was hit by a grenade explosion, which injured him quite badly. Because get injured, Jake decided to hide in a nearby church. Knowing that many of his men were killed and Jake was seriously injured, Murphy, Kim, and Bartlett immediately went to the location of the shootout. But arriving at the location, Murphy's car was ambushed by Jake. It turns out that Murphy and Kim's goal was not to arrest Jake, but to assist him in arresting Nichols and his group. That's because it was not only Jake's daughter who was a victim of Nichols' crimes, but dozens of other girls were also victims. Apparently, apart from doing business and illegal stuff, Nichols also runs a human trafficking business. Meanwhile, Nichols and his sister remained in their magnificent places, even though the hundreds of armed forces guarding them had been killed by Jake. Then suddenly Jake appeared at the base and could corner Nichols and his sister. Then Jake interrogated Nichols regarding the chronology of his daughter's death. At first, Nichols chose to keep silent, but when Jake threatened to kill his younger sister, Nichols was no choice to open his mouth. It turns out that Melissa is still alive after being raped by his man and also the corrupt police. However, Nichols instead killed Melissa, who was already in a dying state, in order to protect Bobby, his only child. In the end, Melissa, who was dying, Nichols drowned to death. It turned out that Nichols' younger sister was also involved. Nichols' confession have been recorded, so it became very strong evidence to put the village chief into prison. However, Jake, who was shrouded in anger and revenge, didn't accept that Nichols was only imprisoned. He intends to kill Nichols in a brutal way, like the brutality experienced by his daughter. However, Murphy managed to calm Jake down. In the end, Jake canceled his intention. In the end, Nichols and his sister were brought to the central prison. Meanwhile, Kim immediately helped Jake, who was already in a dying state. On the way, Murphy intercepted the police car that was taking Nichols and his younger sister to prison. Then Murphy shot Nichols and his younger sister dead. Murphy also had a grudge against Nichols for killing Jake's daughter, whom he considered his own granddaughter. Then, along with this scene, the movie ended.